Hi, I'm Derek O'Reilly, and for over 30 years I've been a licensed London taxi driver. For 20 years, I taught the knowledge to prospective London cab drivers. During this podcast, I'm going to be joined by experts who are going to bring the forgotten and secret history of London to life. Today we're going to look at highway robbery. Hi, today I'm joined by a very interesting person.
Hello there, I'm David Charnick. I'm actually a tour guide in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets and also in the City of London. I've lived in Tower Hamlets all my life and I teach tour guiding there through the local council.
Well, hello David, here we are once again.
Hello Derek, good to see you again, as
and
always.
You, sir. And you, sir. Now, today let's have a little chat about highway robbery. Now, I know we still use that term today, but I suppose it's used more as a laugh, he's committed highway robbery kind of thing.
That's right, yeah, especially when you get overcharged for something, like...
That's it. Yeah, you know very well.
So where's your mask and pistol,
Absolutely. So let's talk about, particularly in the East End, highway robbery and the definitions, because, of course, it didn't necessarily mean on a coach or whatever, did it?
That's right. We've got the image of the highwayman, the dandy highwayman with his tricorn hat, and his little black mask on his horse and holding up the coach. And highway robbery had to be committed on the highway. So in other words, the roads between towns and cities and so on. Except in London, funnily enough. What would normally be just robbery on the streets in other towns and cities in London was highway robbery. Was that any reason to that? Was it a particular act had been passed, or? It wasn't a particular act, no. It was just a sort of custom, really. That's how it worked. Maybe because London was developing so much and the problem was becoming so prevalent that they wanted to make it a more serious offence, because highway robbery was a capital offence. It was such a problem that the death penalty was at least seen to be a deterrent. Whether it was or not, of course, is another story.
Of course, because the East End that I know, you come through Leighton and into Stratford and into Bow and into Mile End, is all heavily built up.
Yeah.
But of course, a couple of hundred years ago, that wouldn't have been the case.
No, it wouldn't, no. I mean, the development of London is relatively late, and developments eastward of London, really you're talking, well, I suppose areas like Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, that sort of thing, yeah, in the 1700s, but really you're talking the late 18th century into the 19th century because of the growth of the docks and industry. So mid-18th century, yep, all fields round here, as they say.
So can you give me an example of a highway robbery that took place in the East End, I should say? Just give me something that stands out.
Yeah, well, to illustrate, how open these places were and how readily highwaymen were operating, I'll just tell you about a surgeon called William Martin. This is 1740, so it's quite early in the 18th century. And he was confronted by a pistol-wielding soldier, or ex-soldier, in the open as he travelled from Bethnal Green to Old Ford. And so he was trotting along in a chaise, which is like a little sort of carriage, pulled by a horse, obviously. And he was heading out to Old Ford, presumably to see a patient. And as he was going along, he's got open fields around him. In the distance, there's a group of people planting peas in a field. But apart from that, no one. And this man stepped out into the road with a pistol. And he's George White. He's an old soldier, but mainly he's very poor. So obviously, as an old soldier, he's brave, but his poverty, spurs him on, as it were. And he brandishes this pistol at Martin and gets him to stop and says, hand over your money and your possessions. Now, Martin has got these driving gloves on, So he thinks, well, I'd better give him something and they'll get rid of him and then I can ride on. So he doesn't think to take his gloves off, and he starts fiddling in his pocket, trying to reach coins, so he could hand him something over. But also, he's playing for time, because he can't shout out in case he gets shot, but he's hoping these people planting the peas will see what's going on. Because obviously highway robbers are less inclined to go through with it if they've got a large number of witnesses. So he's playing for time. He's also trying to make sure that George White doesn't see his watch. This is 1740. You don't have wristwatches in those days. You've got fob watches. So he's got his coat round, trying to obscure the watch. He's got his big fat fingers with his driving gloves, trying to get the coins out, and playing for time in the hopes that someone will look over from the pea planting. Anyway, this is taking so long that White gets fed up. He's like, right, I've had enough of this. I'm going to shoot him. And, I can shoot him and I can grab his stuff and I can make away. Probably on his own carriage, his chaise. So, George White pulled the trigger and the hammer came down, and this is 1740. This is one of those old pistols where you put the bullet down the barrel of the gun, and you've got the little pan with a bit of gunpowder in, and that sets off the main charge.
So you've only got one shot, really.
You've got one shot,
yeah,
and the spark goes through the little hole, the touch hole, to set off the gunpowder to shoot the bullet. And so the hammer came down, knocked the flint, and the powder in the pan fizzled, and that's it. The gun didn't go off.
Oh, what happened?
So suddenly,
next?
well, yeah, you've got this man with a gun that doesn't work, and you've got this man sitting on his chaise with a horsewhip. And horsewhips are designed to be felt by horses that have got thick skin. And people have got quite thin skin, so being horsewhipped really hurts. So as soon as Martin realises that the dynamics have now reversed themselves, he got his horsewhip and he's starting to thrash at George White. And he got down off the chaise and chased White off into the fields. So they go running across the fields. You've got the two of them there. And George White at one point stopped and turned round again and brandished his pistol. Maybe he thought that, Martin might think he'd had a chance to reload or something, or maybe White was just hoping that he could get a bit of action out of the pistol, whatever. But it didn't stop Martin, who happened to see a bit of a broken brick on the ground. So he picked it up and flung it at Wyatt and then carried on chasing him. And then before too long, someone else came along on a horse and they managed to get Wyatt and they took him off to the magistrate.
And what was his punishment?
Well, funnily enough, we don't know. It's not recorded. He only went to the magistrate, so he didn't go before the Old Bailey, so he wasn't put up to court. So presumably he might have been fined, but then again, he didn't have any money. So if he was probably maybe flogged or imprisoned or something on a short term. Mm. Yeah, but so not a serious punishment.
The punishment, just to be clear, if you robbed somebody, you didn't shoot them, mm-hmm. Did you get the same punishment than if you robbed them and you did shoot them?
If it was highway robbery, yeah.
Right.
The thing about the 18th century, it's a time of what's known as the Bloody Code. And a whole shed load of crimes were put on the books as capital offences. So things like pickpocketing. Pickpocketing was a capital offence. So you could be hanged if you were convicted of pickpocketing. The thing was, though, the vast majority of death sentences weren't carried out. We tend to think of the judiciary of previous centuries as being this sort of blind force that would just roll over the innocent and the guilty alike, and you'd be strung up at the slightest provocation. But the reality is that they tried to avoid the death sentence if possible. And if the death sentence should be passed, there were ways that they would try to commute it to, as I say, maybe transportation to the penal colonies, for instance, that kind of thing. So America first, and then after the unpleasantness of the 1770s, down to Australia. and so on.
dear.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Old Bailey, the old courthouse that used to be on the Old Bailey, in the 1700s, depending on what part of the century you're in, between 50 and 60% of the death sentences handed out were not followed through. They were either commuted to something else or pardoned completely.
Well, it's interesting because the general assumption is that, you were sent before the beak and that was it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, but then again, like a lot of popular perceptions, they're really something that has come about over time.
Yeah,
you know?
no, absolutely, definitely. Now, going back to highway robbery, again, my perception, it was always done by a man on a horse robbing a coach. But, of course, there would have been street robberies going on within more urban areas.
All the time. In the West End, well, the developing West End, because, the 1600s, 1700s, you start getting the West End coming into being. And so you've got developers who are putting out streets of houses for affluent tenants. But in the East End, you've got brewers, other tradesmen, that kind of thing. You've got businessmen. You've got, especially as you go into the late 18th century, you're starting to get rich merchants in, early to mid 1700s. You've got places like Limehouse, which have rich merchants living there in Wapping, but they go downriver to Poplar with the coming of the docks and so on. So there were affluent people around. They just weren't sort of particularly socially high.
David, tell me another interesting story about highway robbery in East London.
Well, one of the things about highway robbery is how young some of the people could be who did it. And this is certainly the case for a man called Peter Conway, who was up on 3 charges of highway robbery. The first 2 charges, they were for robberies committed in December 1769. And then in 1770, he was up for murder, which was consequent on a highway robbery.
Right.
The first 2 cases, he actually got off. He was part of a gang, but he wasn't convicted of actually causing the actual robberies.
So he
and
got off on the
deaths.
murder case as well?
The first 2, he wasn't deemed to have been to blame.
Okay.
Laws of joint enterprise would apply today, that if you're part of the gang, you're responsible whether or not you pull the trigger or what have you. But he managed to get off the first 2 charges of highway robbery, but other members of the gang didn't. They were hanged.
Okay.
But Peter Conway, as I say, was about 20 at the time.
So did he carry on with his so-called trade?
Well, the thing was, he seems to have enjoyed it. And so he created his own gang. So it was a gang of 4. There was him, there was a man called Richardson, a man called Jackson, and a man called Fox. And they were all about 20. And they decided to go out on the spree and commit some robberies. So this is May 1770. And they went down to a place called Prince's Square. Now, Prince's Square doesn't exist anymore. It's down Shadwell Way, not too far from Wilton's Music Hall. It's called Swedenborg Gardens now.
Yeah, I know the area well.
Yeah, so just off the highway, or Ratcliffe Highway as it used to be. And it was laid out in the 1720s for Swedish timber merchants, because you had Wellclose Square nearby. It was laid out in the 1680s for Danish-Norwegian timber merchants who were selling timber to help with the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire of 1666. Anyway, they went to a shop, the gang, a man called Dunn. His brother was a gunsmith, and so he had some of his stock in the shop. So they went in, and Robert Dunn served them, and they said, we need a couple of second-hand pistols. So he sold them a couple of horse pistols, which incidentally are big pistols that you use from a horse as opposed to ones for shooting horses.
Right, again, glad you made that clear.
So anyway, they got their pistols and they went off on a spree of drinking for a day or so. And then later they decided to set out and actually hold someone up. So they're in Stepney, and the first thing that happens is this man comes along called Kilpack, Thomas Kilpack. He's a footman, so he's a servant. And Patrick Conway goes towards him to stop him, to rob him. And he has a look at him and he says, he hasn't got anything. So just let him go on, no point holding him up.
Right.
But then shortly afterwards, as they're getting further into Stepney, so an area that's more built up, they saw these two men coming along. One's called Venables, one's called Rogers. And Venables was a butcher and Rogers was a carpenter. So used to using their hands, And Venables was a well set up fellow, and they decide to stop them and rob them. Now, Jackson, he says, oh, hang on a minute. No, we can't take them on. They've looked far too strong for us. So, well, you go ahead, but I'm off. And so he started walking away down the road. But he was still within earshot when the incident occurred. So Conway and Richardson, they've got the pistols. Fox is unarmed. And so they stop Venables and Rogers at pistol point. So Venables, maybe he was just too confident, or maybe he thought they looked a bit tentative or whatever. He's got a big stick with him. So the first thing he does is knocks Richardson to the ground, and then Fox. So he fells them with this big whacks from his stick, and they try to get up, and he whacks them down again. So they're on the floor. And you've got Conway standing there holding his gun. Remember, one shot. This is 17...
Yeah, of course. No time to reload.
Absolutely. No time to reload at all. It's 1770. So what's he going to do? He can't threaten both of them because he can only shoot one of them. And so he has this little quandary, but as he's standing there, Richardson, from the ground, managed to get his pistol out, and he shot Venables. And so Venables dropped. So Conway just pulled his trigger and shot Rogers, and Rogers fell to the ground as well. Both men died instantaneously, So what happens now? They've stopped them to rob them, but they're in a fairly built-up area, and there's been two shots at night time when, everything's quiet and the sound carries, and they think, we can't stop here. Someone will come to the window, someone will come to the door, whatever. So they just run. And Fox picks up a hat belonging to one of the victims. It's not specified which one. As they're running along, they're getting within sight of St Dunstan's Church, and he thinks, oh, hang on a minute, this is incriminating evidence. So he flung it into a field, and off they went. And then they again went on a drinking spree around the Stepney area down to Wapping and so on, and then heading upriver to the city, to Billingsgate. And that was that for a couple of days. But the thing is, Jackson, the one who walked away, he got a bit wary, in case he should get arrested or whatever, if the finger should point at him, or maybe he wanted a bit of immunity or just wanted a bit of cash. But he went to the authorities and he handed himself in as an information. Now, this is what these days we would call turning Queen's evidence. In other words, you give information in exchange for immunity.
Or in the East End, a grass.
A grass, yeah. A deal. Anyway, so in exchange for immunity and £100, that's a decent sum of money in 1770.
Definitely.
Yeah, he revealed all. He spilled every bean in the can. And so Richardson and Conway were arrested for highway robbery and murder. Now, the thing is that Fox hadn't actually been involved in hurting anyone. All he'd done was to get clubbed down on the floor and then to pick up a hat which he threw away. So it seems that no action was taken against Fox. But Conway and Richardson, that was very different. They'd shot these men dead. And so they were up for murder and they were hanged. Now, this is a time when if you were hanged for murder, either your body would be handed over to the medical colleges for dissection, for the medical students to practice, or you would be hung up in chains as a warning to the others. And that's what happened to Conway and Richardson. They were taken to Bow Common.
I know it well.
Yep. Well, Bow Common Lane, because the Common isn't there anymore. It's
No.
one of these traditional East End open spaces
Yeah.
that no longer survive. And the bodies were hung up, presumably in gibbets, the sort of body-shaped cages, so that when they started falling apart, they wouldn't fall apart too quickly. And people sort of flocked to see them. I mean, the idea was this was supposed to be a deterrent. But people came along and, there they are. Ooh, these are the robbers. Ooh. And at one point, they had a little fair there, there's people gathering and they're selling food and drink and stuff like that. Come and see the rotting corpses. But, so people had a rather more morbid sense of entertainment in those days.
Now, obviously, we've mentioned pistols. Presumably clubs and other weapons were used. I mean, was there a free availability of pistols, bullets and other bits of paraphernalia that would be required to commit these offences?
Oh, these things were freely available, absolutely. I mean, as I say, the pistols, they were just bought quite legally over the counter. I'll tell you something, though, in connection with those pistols. They bought the pistols, and it was only when Conway and his gang went out to commit the robbery, they realised they'd forgotten something. They hadn't bought any bullets.
No, tell me more, David. How did they get around that problem?
Well, again, this is 1770, so it's a time when you don't have guns like they are today. You would have, it's basically a tube, metal tube, and you put your powder charge down there, put your spherical bullet in, and then a bit of cloth to hold it in place. So they didn't have any bullets. So what they did was they got a pewter spoon. So bullets were made of lead. Pewter is lead and tin, so it's quite soft. And they got this pewter spoon. They just cut it up into little bits and curled them round so that they would make slugs that were big enough to go into the barrel of the pistol. And that's what they used. So that's how Venables and Rogers were shot. They weren't shot with ordinary bullets. They were shot with bits of pewter spoon.
Incredible story. Now, what would have brought about or brought the end of sort of highway robbery? I mean, it actually hasn't ended because, let's be fair, there's still muggings and street crime committed today. But, I mean, what slowed the progress down for these people?
Just increased law enforcement, really. You get, of course, in 1829, the establishment of the Metropolitan Police by Sir Robert Peel, who was the Home Secretary at the time. And he didn't just say, we need a police force. He laid out, how a police force should work, patrols, that kind of thing, a proper structure. The whole metropolitan area was divided up into divisions, and each division had a letter and so on. And they had a local hierarchy of authority and monitoring and so on. So it was increasing policing, basically, that started slowing this down. Although, as you say, of course, violence on the streets never really stopped. It just sort of commuted, as it were, to a different form of robbery.
And the demise of sort of stagecoaches in favour of other modes of transport, I suppose this would have had an effect.
Yeah. Stagecoaches were vulnerable on the highway. That was the thing. And the idea of the highwayman holding up the stagecoach isn't a figment of our imagination or romanticism. It was real. But then in the 1840s, you get the railways, and the railways come in, and they do away with stagecoach trade completely. By the 1850s, the only people driving a stagecoach are doing it as an equestrian sport. It's not done as a commercial enterprise anymore because the trains are there. And you can't really stand in front of a speeding train with a gun and say, stand. You wouldn't be standing.
No,
very long.
absolutely not. No, you'd have been well done away with. And can you give me any more stories to end with on highway robbery?
Well, here's the big one. John Austin. He was the last man to be hanged at Tyburn. He was hanged there in 1783. And he was from Bethnal Green. And he was hanged for highway robbery and attempted murder of a man called John Spicer. This is a time when, as I mentioned, you get development to the west of the city, and development was creeping along to Tyburn. And Tyburn was a village by the River Tyburn. I mean, nowadays it's Marble Arch. It's well central to West London. But in those days it was a village. But it was being reached by London. And the last thing these developers wanted when they were putting out their terraces of nice Georgian houses for their nice Georgian tenants was for public hangings to be taking place down the road with all these crowds of people jostling away, pickpockets, people selling the confessions from the gallows that had actually been written the day before and that kind of thing. So they had to stop hangings at Tyburn. And so they moved them to Newgate Jail, where the Old Bailey stands now. That's why the road is wide at the top. The road was widened to allow the crowds to gather to watch the hangings outside the jail on Monday mornings.
Okay, right.
Yeah, Monday was hanging day. But John Austin, as I say, he was a highway robber from Bethnal Green. But what he did with John Spicer was not typical, because to say the highway robber would normally just stop someone. You accost someone, you demand their money. But he went out to Ilford. You mentioned coming in from Essex. Well, he went to Ilford. He was at the Coach and Horses, one of these stagecoach inns. And that's where he met John Spicer. John Spicer was coming in from Grays. He was heading for London. He wanted work, basically. And he met Austin at the Coach and Horses, and they got talking. And Austin said, I can help you. So let's journey into London together. So they did. And he took Spicer to Whitechapel, to the White Swan, which was an inn on the south side of Whitechapel Road. And he got Spicer installed with a drink. And he says, you stay there, I'll go and find us some proper lodgings. And he got a bit of cash out of Spicer to get some food as well for them. Anyway, Spicer's there for about 3 or 4 hours. And then suddenly a man turns up called Patrick Bowman. And he said he's a friend of Austin's. Austin's found them some lodgings. And if Spicer comes with him, with Bowman, he'll take him to Austin. So they go along to the Blade Bone, which was at the Mile End Turnpike. So Mile End Gate, which is at the bottom of Cambridge Heath Road, if you know the area.
Yes, no, yeah.
So top of Sydney Street.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they went to the Blade Bone. So Spicer thinks, oh, well, we're going to stay here tonight. And Austin says, oh, we're not staying here. We're just going up the road. So it's getting dark now, and so they start walking off. And after a while, they're in the middle of a field, walking along by a ditch. And Spicer says, it's a funny place to go looking for lodgings. And then Patrick Bowman produced his cutlass from under his smock, and he sort of threatened Spicer with it. Now, whether Spicer was a bit overconfident or whether it was just some burly country man, whatever, but he wasn't having this. And so he went for Bowman, even though he was unarmed. And they were fighting, and Bowman was managing to get the occasional cut in with the cutlass on his hands and arms and so on. So it wasn't long before Spicer was bleeding. Now, Austin came over, and Spicer doesn't know that Bowman and Austin are working together, he thinks Austin's going to help him. So, of course, Austin gets him down on the ground, and Austin and Bowman truss him up, and then they start robbing him. As you can imagine, this has not been a silent process. There's been a lot of noise and commotion. Now, nearby was a man called Strong. And Strong was a gardener. And he came over and to see what was going on. And he saw the two men trying to rob Spicer, who was on the ground trussed up. So Strong, James Strong, he went running over to them, and so Bowman and Austin, they're away, because the last thing they want is witnesses. And off they go, and Spicer is trussed on the ground, so Strong passes him, trying to catch up with the other two, but then they stop. Bowman brandishes his cutlass. Austin brandishes his stick, and it's getting quite dark now, so Strong thinks that's another sword or another blade. So he thinks, I'm not having this, I'm not having two of them after me. So he gives up the pursuit and he goes back to Spicer. And Spicer's bleeding fairly freely at this point. And so Strong just, who clearly lived up to his name, he just picks him up.
Yeah, strong by name, strong by nature.
Yeah. He carried him back to the place where he worked. And Giles Wells's house. Giles Wells employed him as a gardener. And he takes him back to Giles Wells's house. And they untie him and they look after his wounds and they take him off to the London hospital. So this is 1783, remember. So the London hospital had been where it is for about 30 years, give or take.
Right, yeah, of course.
So the next morning, James Strong, the gardener, goes back to the field where Spicer was attacked because he thinks, he's a poor man. Maybe the attackers dropped something, They hadn't, but what was there was John Austin's hat. And Austin had come back himself to look for the hat. And when they had met the night before, it was so dark that in the morning they didn't recognise each other. So no one knew that the other one was involved. Except, of course, that Austin was all over blood from Spicer. So Strong, as you say, strong by name, strong by nature, he overpowered Austin and dragged him back to Giles Wells's house, and they locked him in the stable until they could get him taken away and up before the magistrate, etc. So Austin thinks, hang on a minute, I've got some of Spicer's possessions. I've got his handkerchief and his stockings. Because remember, this is a time before socks, when men and women wore stockings. And so he hid them in the straw. So anyway, off he goes to the magistrates under custody, But Wells thinks, hang on a minute, maybe he's hidden something in the stable. So he gets one of his men to search the stable, and they find the handkerchief and the stockings, which are Spicer's. And that is the evidence that hangs Austin. So there you go. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and as I say, the last person to be hanged at Tyburn.
What an incredible story. So did the other guy get away?
Bowman, yeah. It was only Austin who was actually arrested. Bowman seems to have eluded investigations. So what happened to him, we don't know. He just disappears.
Oh, so that's the story of the last man to be executed at Tyburn.
Oh, yeah. Mind you, it wasn't on the old Tyburn tree, the old triangular gallows.
Yes.
Because that had been taken down by then. It was just an ordinary gallows. But it wasn't it was a big occasion in a way because it was the last hanging at Tyburn. But it sort of went out with a bit of a whimper, really, because although Austin gave a show of bravado, when they actually got him there and got the noose round his neck, he suddenly became a bit more sort of nervous.
Contrite, yeah.
Yeah, and he was sort of trembling, and people said at the time he was trembling so much that the gallows was starting to shake. I mean, whether that's just exaggeration or what, we don't know. But that was a time when you didn't have a drop. You didn't stand on the trapdoor and the trapdoor falls away and you drop. You had a drop of a couple of inches or so.
So you died by strangulation, effectively.
Yep.
Yeah.
You would have the noose round your neck and you would be in a cart, and then they just drive the cart away. And so you drop a few inches and you effectively strangle, yeah. The noose actually went round the back of his head. It wasn't on there properly, and it took him 10 minutes to die. Doing the Tyburn jig, as they called it, you know, the involuntary spasms of the body trying to breathe. Yeah.
So that's the end of Tyburn. Well,
Yep.
David, on that happy note, I suppose, we'll say goodbye.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.